Hello, how's your week going? Fine, good, America, yes. Let's start with the components of GDP in the United States of America and their percentage change from the start of the Great Recession, right, all the way back to 2007, and how much they've either gone up or gone down, the components of GDP. I've picked out the particular ones I wanted to talk about today for a particular reason, so we'll forget the others. The highlighted one at the top, exports, by far more than anything else has gone up as a positive contribution to US GDP is exports. Go down to the next highlighted one, which is personal consumption expenditures. Now it's up a incy-wincy bit in the United States, and that's since the start of the Great Recession, right? Which gives us our gross domestic product at the bottom, which is an even smaller incy-wincy bit up on where it was at the start of the recession. Remember that calculated risk chart, and it had just got back up to the top to where it started. That represents that. But what is important, and the take from this is, the United States can still produce goods and services. It can produce goods and services and sell them as exports to people that have got the money to buy them. The personal consumption expenditures being incy-wincy big there shows it's not the American people that have the money to pay for the American created goods and services. It's other people outside the country. There is a huge demand side problem in the American economy. The American people, on average, do not have the money to buy American-made goods and services. But outsiders do, so there's been no problem with the exporting. They're exporting them to the people that can afford it, and that's not American people. Right. Financial Times, US Society, US poverty measure paints bleaker picture. Poverty in the US is even worse than previously thought, according to a new official measure that takes better account of the cost of living. I won't go on because you probably already turned your mind off already, because you don't want to hear about poverty in the United States. You probably thought that, oh, they've all got mobile phones, so they're not really poor or something. So I'll move on to an excellent article in the New York Times, I think, op-ed by Joe Nocera, who wrote that book with What's-a-Face about the great subprime and how it was caused and why it was caused. And it was so good that I've forgotten who she is and what the book was called. Anyway, To Fix Housing, See the Data by Joe Nocera. In Miami recently, I met up with Laurie Goodman, a senior managing director of Amherst Securities. I'd been trying to meet her ever since I'd read an article that she had written in March entitled The Case for Principal Reductions. But our schedules never seemed to mesh, so when I noticed that we were both going to be at a conference in Miami, I wangled a breakfast appointment. It was one of the more illuminating breakfasts I've had in a while. So, from deeper into the bowels of the article, enter Laurie Goodman, one of the country's foremost authorities on mortgage-backed securities. She is also one of the most data-driven people I've ever met. At breakfast, she was constantly pointing me to one chart or another that backed up her claims. She's not into politics, says my friend and her client, Daniel Albert, of Westwood Capital. She's using data to tell the truth. Her truth begins with a shocking calculation. Of the 55 million mortgages in America, more than 10 million are reasonably likely to default. That is a staggering number, and it is in large part because so many homes are worth so much less than the mortgage the homeowners are holding. That is, they're underwater. A second calculation is that the supply of housing is going to drastically outstrip demand for the foreseeable future. She estimates that the glut of unneeded homes could get as high as 6.2 million over the next 6 years. The primary reason for this, she says, is that household formation has been very low in recent years, presumably because of the grim economy. Young adults are living with their parents instead of moving into their own homes, etc. What's more, nearly 20% of current homeowners no longer qualify for a mortgage, as lending standards have tightened. Back to the highlighted, of the 55 million mortgages in America, more than 10 million are reasonably likely to default. And this whole article and drive of many people on the blogosphere is that principal reductions are utterly essential, not just for the American housing economy, but for the American economy in general. Somehow, the American people have got to be relieved of their debt burdens so they can go spending again. A poll by CBS News, New York Times, April 2011, where we note, prefer smaller government and fewer services, 55% of Americans. Prefer bigger government and more services, only 33%. But if they're a bit more specific with their question, prefer smaller government, fewer services in health. That was big before. Now it's more precise when you ask a precise question. Prefer smaller government, fewer services in health, only 37%. Prefer bigger government, more services in health, over half. Right, a little snip. This is from some rag of a newspaper, so I've cut the top off it. Forget what, USA Today? Looked a tatty bit of a rag to me, but still, these paragraphs work in this presentation. Households have reduced debt by $549 billion since 2007, mostly by cutting mortgages through defaults and paying down credit cards. During that time, the federal government has added more than $4 trillion in debt, pushing the country's total borrowing to a record $36.5 trillion, excluding the financial industry, according to the Federal Reserve. In other words, the personal people have dropped down slightly, federal government have gone more borrowing, and the overall number is up to 36.5 between the private and the public sectors. Government will eventually need to reduce the deficit, says Susan Lund, research director at McKinsey Global Institute, part of the business consulting firm. But it's a very difficult balancing act to avoid withdrawing stimulus too soon while stopping before you borrow too much. DecaturDaily.com, this is just a little strange thing from America. DU, that's Decatur Utilities, no water or power for illegal immigrants. Decatur Utilities now prohibits illegal immigrants from obtaining electric, gas, water, sewer services, an official said on Friday. Stephen Perkle, DU business manager and chief finance officer, said DU previously required residents seeking utilities to provide identification, but their immigration status was not relevant. We did not document or confirm whether or not these citizens or aliens were here legally, Perkle said. Because of the new law, we are going through the process to confirm that they are either a citizen or an alien or here legally. If not, we deny them services. I'll just put that in just to show that there's microcosms of trickiness all over the place. So this is the link to Europe and a bit of a sum up. Listening to discussions on economic policy themes at a recent global economic symposium in the German city of Kiel, I was struck by the ubiquity of coordination failures in a large number of policy areas. This is Wolfgang Munschau predominantly talking about the euro area, but it's I've put it here because it's similar for the United States as well, and its problems. It is fashionable to pin today's problems on weak leadership, as I mentioned yesterday, I think. But this is missing the point. The present generation may not be particularly impressive. The Eurozone is clearly unlucky to have such leaders as Mr. Berlusconi at this time, but would Gerhard Schröder really have handled this any better than German Chancellor Angela Merkel? And do we really think François Hollande as French president could solve the crisis? And say for America, okay, Obama doesn't seem particularly anything, but if Clinton was in charge, would it be so much better? Or pick your leader. The point being that the problems are bigger than the people. Jack Abramoff's Guide to Buying Congressmen. A little video there if you follow the link. Disgraced ex-lobbyist Jack Abramoff is out of jail. He was released in June. He now works as an accountant at a kosher pizza parlor, and he needs a literary agent. I was actually thinking of writing a book, he told 60 Minutes, The Idiot's Guide to Buying a Congressman, and it takes, obviously, a disgraced lobbyist to say just what lobbying is all about, because the rest of the lobbyists are still at it. Jeremy Warner in the Daily Telegraph gives us this picture, which is impressive and scary at the same time. The illustration in this blog, drawn from recent IMF spillover assessment, shows just how exposed to financial services the UK really is. No comment is required, etc., etc., other than to point out to the first image, and I'll give you a bigger blowout in 9b, which shows that the UK has a bigger external balance sheet than any other country in the world, and you can see it slightly better on this one, where they've done the liabilities, the balance sheet, size of balance sheet, its assets and liabilities. It's a bit tricky. But the UK is bigger than the United States, just to give people an idea. And you can see that there's other countries in Europe there are disproportionately huge as well. No sign of China and things like that. And this is to drive home the magnitude of the problem again, or establish it in the banks, the banks that have created all the finance that has kept everything above water for the last 30 years in Europe. And these are, in dark blue, the old mortgage-backed securities from the United States, problem securities, that are still residing on the banks of European banks, the books of European banks. RBS, Royal Bank of Scotland, there at the top with 80 billion euros worth. The light blue is sovereign debt. So HSBC is still stuffed with that old stuff. Deutsche Bank stuffed with it. And ING, for the size of it, is quite stuffed as well. But if we go, I've just gone down to the bottom of the list because the light blue gets bigger and takes over with BNP Paribas, that Reggie Middleton's going on about what a dreadful explosive potential BNP has, is stuff full of sovereign debt. But UniCredit at the bottom, which is the last credit Anstalt that caused the problems in history. UniCredit is the surviving part of Credit Anstalt, and that is horribly stuffed full of sovereign debt. So with a problem with sovereign debt, UniCredit, which is coming under the spotlight a lot lately, is in a bad way. Right, ECB bond buying. This is a natty little chart. It's really quite good. Should we start at the top or the bottom? Let's start at the top. The purpley line that's right at the top there is Portuguese bonds that are the interest rate. So you get the idea that the market says no to Portuguese bonds. Green in Ireland is coming down and down. That for the moment, Ireland gets a pass. The two important ones on that top chart are the blue and the yellow, which is Italy and Spain. Now, as I say, if Spain was on its own and everybody else was all right, everybody would be tearing their hair out about what a basket case Spain was. But Italy has taken the market's fancy as being worse for the moment. And you can see, although the Portuguese and Irish bonds take the chart to impressive heights of 12 and 14%, the blue line is well over 6% now for Italian bonds, which is well out of their control. You just can't. Their whole finances are acceptable on 2, 3, at a push 4% on their very large debt, but when it gets up to 6, it's out of control. The ECB, the person that's been pushed into the room to look after the children, that doesn't want to be doing it, is doing it. It's still looking after the children. And if we go down to the blue and the pink charts at the bottom, that's the magnitude of their buying. They've been buying lately, because you can see the lumpy bit in blue, and that's increasing the pink, which is the amount of those bonds that they have in stock, that they have actually bought. And you can see they're ramping up the amount that they're buying. They're buying Spanish and particularly Italian bonds, but still the Italian bonds are going up and are through 6. And that shows either that the ECB absolutely must stick a pin in at 6 or 5.5 and say, I'm going to buy every single bond that is out there to keep that rate below that number that I put the pin in at, or the whole thing's going to blow sky high. And the question will come round again, do you want to be the European Central Bank of a zone that needs a central bank, or do you want to go home? In other words, you're going to have to keep your job by doing what you don't want to do and what is illegal for you to do, or the whole thing's going to blow. Right, where are we now? This is out this morning. Another EU measure, PMI, productivity. Productivity falls at the fastest rate since March 2009. It's like Jaws, do. Behind everything, there's another recession coming, which is going to knock all of their fancy, hopeful calculations completely off the table, and they're going to have to start again. And is this the last one? Yeah, it's from an article that I'll try and remember while I'm reading it. This is a personal email printed by permission from Michael Pettis, the China expert who's dabbling in Europe, to Mish. We're well past that stage. By now it seems to me neither wisdom nor cooperation among world leaders is going to get us out of the debt and currency problems that we face. Rather than try to prevent a major disruption of the policy goal, now should be to engineer as quickly as possible the least disorderly and disruptive unravelling of the financial markets in the peripheral countries. And while it may help relieve frustration to excoriate European leaders for having made poor decisions, we shouldn't assume that there really is a set of right decisions that will lead us out of this mess. I think there isn't. And that is finishing to sum up to say the problems are now bigger than the people, the politicians, whoever. It doesn't matter who's in charge, showing leadership or not. The problems are too big, because the only way out in Europe is ECB printing, and for the United States, huge amounts of debt forgiveness. And there's a mental block there. If we do debt forgiveness now, is that the end of the economy as we've known it ever since the Second World War? And it would be. And nobody has any idea how it would go forward after that. So the chances are they won't have the courage to make that debt forgiveness work, or even attempt it. So yes, we're still doomed.